When it comes to royalty within the vegetable kingdom, there's only one variety that wears a crown. Its tender leaves taste sweeter when kissed by frost, and the feature presentation is a nutritional powerhouse that's excellent enjoyed fresh, simmered into soups, or simply roasted. But growing broccoli in the South comes with unique challenges. Planting at the right time, proactive pest control, and proper harvesting techniques are essential. So let's explore this garden grow nobility from seed to success. I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. When it comes to planting at the right time, first and foremost, you need to check your local extension service for a planting guide. Here in my Austin, Texas garden for Travis County, we can begin planting our broccoli from transplants or seedlings beginning in the fall. That being said, if you want to plant from seed, which you can, and this will give you access to more varieties than you might find at your local garden center, you're going to need to start that at the end of July or early August. In most seasons, I choose to buy my transplants from a local grower, and this gives me a shortcut in the process because as much as I would like to start from seed, I would need to be doing that indoors, right? Because if you're in a similar growing zone, you know it's very hot in the middle of summer or late July. And if you grow these seedlings outside, they're just going to be stressed out. You're not going to be successful. And when it comes to the local planting guide that I've historically referenced for my timing in the garden, you can also plant broccoli from transplants beginning in January. I think this is a very tricky timeline to deal with because, like I just mentioned, we can get very warm very quickly. And moreover, if we're talking about 60 to 70 days or so before that broccoli crown is ready to harvest, that means you'll be pushing into the month of March, potentially April, and we are getting very warm at that point in time, often into the 90s, and that's just not going to make for the highest quality broccoli. So growing in the fall and the winter has been my point of action, and I think that's probably one of the safest ways to go. However, you do have to be ready for cold weather, and I'll be going over some of my points for successfully protecting your broccoli through freezes coming up later in the video. So do make sure that you understand the difference between planting from seed versus transplant. This is all about timing. If you're planting from seed, you'll need to start much earlier. I find this to be one of the most common points of misunderstanding when it comes to planting our broccoli. Folks want to grab a pack of seeds because oftentimes they're available at the plant store at the same time that our transplants are available. And even though the transplants are what we need to put in the ground, you might see that package of seeds and think, I'm going to grow a bunch of broccoli, and hooray for you, you should, and you can do this. But if we are in the month of January or February, you are going to be far behind, and that hot weather is going to roll through and it is going to crush your broccoli dreams. The next point of order is going to be soil preparation. For this, you want to employ some high quality compost, preferably from your very own backyard pile. This is going to be full of indigenous microorganisms. It's going to be a labor of love and only really going to cost you some time. But if you do need to purchase some compost, you want to look for a high quality brand. One that I often go to is the Happy Frog soil conditioner. Now this may come with a high price tag, but you're investing in soil biology, and that's going to be really important when it comes to growing healthy plants, which are more resistant to pests and disease. They'll be more nutritious as they grow stronger. So it is an investment, but just remember, next time around, you need to start that pile of leaf mold, you need to get your compost pile going, and you need to do that several months in advance so that it will be mature and ready to use in your garden. The next thing that you might consider adding to your garden soil is an organic fertilizer. I would point you to a granular organic fertilizer, something with an NPK ratio in the range of 4:6:4. That's got a little bit more phosphorus than nitrogen or potassium, but it's fairly balanced. The Sustain brand is one that I've used for a long time, but I will say here in my garden, I've been leaning more towards the use of inoculants and biology to aid in growing my plants. And I used some of my homegrown compost, which I added some biochar, some mushroom block substrate, and the MicroLife multipurpose fertilizer. Now this one is a little bit higher in nitrogen, which is the first number that corresponds to leafy green top growth, which initially is a good thing. And I will say that throughout the growing season, I have not been side dressing my broccoli plants with any granular fertilizer. But what I have been doing is inoculating them. I made a short video about compost extract that I make with worm castings. Shout out to Austin Worm Lab. You want to check that out because this is a really easy way to produce a high quality extract that you can easily apply to your garden. You only need like a little bit of a mesh bag, a cup of worm castings, and a 5-gallon bucket, and you're on your way to growing some really strong plants. So while I initially applied this directly to the roots of my broccoli transplants before I put them in the ground, I also followed up every 4 to 6 weeks by drenching them with the same mix. Plants and soil biology will partner together in a symbiotic relationship, and this will allow the soil nutrients that are available to plants to be exchanged via these microorganisms in the plant roots, and that is the most organic, sustainable, regenerative way to go in the garden. The next thing that I want to talk about is plant spacing for your broccoli. Now, you will need to do some translation here depending on your garden setup, but I want you to first understand that what I'm doing is planting in raised beds, and these beds are all 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. The soil depth is around 10 to 12 inches. I have cultivated below the soil initially, and the bed frame is about 8 inches tall. That may give you a little bit of orientation when it comes to my method versus your planting space, but keep in mind the spacing between plants is going to be the same. So what I'm looking for is 18 inches between each broccoli plant. All right, this allows for that broccoli plant to mature. They're going to get, maybe 24 inches wide, sometimes even bigger than that. When we get that little transplant at the nursery, it looks kind of small. Don't be tempted to plant them closer together because they're going to need all that space. You don't want them to be cramped. The leaves, are going to have a tough time. They're going to be competing for light and for nutrients in the soil. So give them the space that they need to grow properly and grow healthy. My strategy for planting broccoli in these raised beds has evolved over time, but what I've gotten to is 10 plants in each one of these raised beds. And I will do that in 2 rows. These are centered in the raised bed, but spaced 20 inches apart. Now I'm centering these rows strategically in this raised bed so that I can allow for some interplanting on the east and west and potentially the south side of these raised beds, but it also gives the plants the capacity to grow to full maturity without really going out of bounds. And that will also translate to my protocols for protecting them through freezing temperatures. So you can see some images from when I landed these broccoli plants, and they were really small. It looked like there was plenty of space to grow other things, but fast forward, you can see rapidly these big broccoli leaves took off, really filled in the space, and there wasn't much room for anything below them to get light to grow. Now I want to talk about how I like to stake my broccoli plants, because if you look closely, you might have noticed already that I've got them staked with some little bamboo pieces in there, and I use some clips that are reusable as well. You want to make sure when you clip your broccoli plants, you do it up high on the plant. That will give you the most integrity. But I want to mention that initially after planting, I didn't stake these broccoli plants at first. I wanted them to get established, feel some of the resistance from the environmental conditions and be strong. But what happens that I've observed later in the season, if we get a cold front or some strong winds, this can lodge your broccoli plants, and although they will correct themselves over time and kind of curl and follow the sun and point back up, that's not really any good, because what I want to achieve is upright, uniform growth. I think this is the best thing for those broccoli plants. One thing that can happen is those leaves, if they are left sitting on the ground, you'll get some insects coming along and chewing on them, but also, and potentially more importantly, is the ability to intercrop alongside these broccoli plants. So I mentioned in my spacing technique how I like to employ some cropping on the east and west side. If you ensure uniform growth habit with these broccoli plants, that's going to enable you to do that successfully. But if they kind of lay down and go sideways, then it's going to take up some of that space, and you'll honestly just be missing out on growing some of that food. And here's where I also want to interject just a little snippet about intercropping and how to choose what you can grow alongside of your broccoli, because you need to be careful with this. You want to choose faster producing crops, generally things that produce in, say, 30 to 45 days, but also crops with similar fertilizer requirements, because if you're going to be employing fertilizer and you set that up in your raised bed ahead of time, or you're following up with it throughout the growing season, you need to take into consideration the needs of those crops as you choose them. For instance, broccoli is forming a big flower head. We're harvesting the crown before it flowers, but it needs that phosphorus to go big and strong, right? So if you are planting some leafy greens alongside of it, which really are promoted more by nitrogen, okay, the first number in the NPK, they might not be getting the nitrogen that they need, but more importantly, if they're getting an excess of phosphorus, which produces fruits, roots, and flowers, think about it. We get a stretch of 80-degree temperatures like we are this week, that can spur them to bolt, right? They're going to go shoot up, go to flower, go to seed. So you want to create an equilibrium there by choosing crops such as beets, carrots, radishes, along that order. But just as well, you could drop in some cool season flowers, probably some low growing ones such as stock or even pansies or violas. The next tip that I highly encourage you to get in tune with is monitoring for pests. What you're primarily going to see in the cool season will be cabbage loopers or the striped cabbage worms, and these are going to start off really small. As a matter of fact, if you really get in tune with the life cycle of these pests, what you can begin to see is their clusters of eggs, which are really kind of flat, yellowish or white in nature, often covered in a mucous membrane, so you might not see that it looks like a cluster of eggs. It's just kind of like a little goopy thing on your leaf or somewhere on the stem of the broccoli. But this is a great way to cut off these infestations of the past. You can simply wipe them or smash them, pull them off. Likewise, once the caterpillars begin to emerge, they are so tiny and oftentimes translucent, so you can barely see them. But if you look on a regular basis, actively using both hands underneath those leaves, come out in the evening with a flashlight, take a good look under those plants and see what you find. And that will be a great resource for organically navigating these pest pressures throughout the season. Now, I really like to rely on physical removal as much as anything, because this means that I don't have to spray anything on my crops, and that's really my goal here in this garden. I don't want to apply any even organic pesticides, honestly, and I haven't done so this year. And do you see some holes in the leaves of my crops? Yes, you do. Is that okay with me? 100%, because imperfect food that's grown organically with care, that's nutritionally dense, grown in my backyard, it doesn't matter. Also, think about something like insect netting. You can construct a low tunnel structure. I'm going to go into more detail on that. You will be able to create a physical barrier against these moths laying eggs on your broccoli plant. So, case closed, no infestations whatsoever. In monitoring on a regular basis, what you may start to see is some signs of trouble if you look closely, because looking down on those broccoli plants, you start to see some spaces on those leaves that look like they're not holes, but what's going on there? Well, if you flip it over, you might begin to see that it's a breakout of these caterpillars. They are so small that they can only eat half of that leaf membrane early in the stages of their development. So you won't have a hole in that leaf, but that can be a good indicator for you needing to take action, because as they get bigger, you will see holes start to develop in those leaves. They'll take out whole leaves and you'll just see the rib, and oftentimes they're doing this overnight into the early morning hours, and when you go out there in the middle of the day, you won't see them at all. They're hiding, they're curled up somewhere, they're napping, they're digesting all of those broccoli leaves. Now, this is not the worst thing in the world. In most cases, this isn't enough to set back your broccoli plants, but with a heavy infestation, it could deprive them of those leaf structures, which would reduce their photosynthesis. They're growing more slowly, they're more susceptible to stress. So you do everything to support them, and you enact some physical removal. You be the beneficial insect or beneficial human. something like that. Now, when you look up remedies for caterpillars on your broccoli plants, you're likely to see a couple of different options. The first one that I noticed recently was spinosad. Now, I think this is a heavy hitter when it comes to organic controls, and it's not necessary in order to control caterpillars. But maybe you have some other players in there that you want to take care of, and that's your choice. But I don't think you need to do it. BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis, will target caterpillars specifically, which will include beautiful butterflies. So, it's going to be a lower order control, which will only hone in on those caterpillars and not harm ladybugs, other chewing insects that might be benefits to you as they are predators of other garden pests. You should go with something lower level. I don't truly advocate for spraying these controls in the garden, but I do want you to be aware of them and their differences, and you can make the choice for yourself. I want to talk a little bit more about fertilization, because earlier this season I was with a client and we were looking at their cauliflower and broccoli plants, which will have the same fertilization requirement, something a little bit higher in phosphorus to encourage that big head that we're thereafter. What we saw was huge green plants, and my first thought was they're getting more nitrogen than anything else because they have beautiful huge leaves, which they looked super healthy. They looked really, really good. But it could be important to note that at some point in the season, right, we want to have the right nutrients going to our broccoli plants. I think that if you set up a healthy soil with organic matter and biology, the needs for organic fertilizer are diminished greatly. Maybe you don't need to fertilize, but take this into consideration as those heads begin to form and you're just thinking, I don't know, I want them to size up. I have one trick that I want to share with you, and that is my friends at Neptune's Harvest Fish Fertilizer. I've been using this one for over a decade in my garden. It's a concentrated liquid fertilizer. They take these fish straight from the dock and they process them without any harsh chemicals at low temperatures. You're getting a high quality, nutrient rich product, and this is going to have just enough phosphorus that if you're ready for those heads that are starting to form to get bigger, feed them some Neptune's Harvest, because that is like dynamite for these broccoli plants. Whether it's cabbage, cauliflower, you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck if you choose Neptune's Harvest in that. So that can be something to help push them at the right time. And another thing that is really important to consider is the watering needs. As those heads begin to form, you want to make sure that you're providing the right amount of moisture on a consistent basis. I'm not saying you need to water them heavily, drench them, but make sure they're getting the water they need. The soil should always be allowed to dry out slightly in between waterings, and I use my finger to check on the watering needs of my plants. Get in tune with that soil. It's really the best thing to do. But as those heads form, it is really critical. If you let it dry out, or conversely, if you get too much water in there, that's going to inhibit the rate of development for that broccoli crown. So we've been keeping our eyes on the prize this whole time, that broccoli crown that's like a trophy in the garden. It's coming, right? It's forming. You're wondering, when is it ready to harvest? This is probably one of the biggest questions for many of you out there, and I want you to take into consideration this, all right? When that broccoli crown starts to get bigger and bigger, you look at it. It's really kind of tightly formed. All those little, broccoli flowers are young. There's in those little beads of broccoli in that head. They're really close together. And that's what you want to be keenly in tune with, because as they start to grow out and get looser, you start to see some unevenness in the broccoli heads, then you'll know that those flowers are getting closer to opening and emerging. It's a balancing act here. You want to get them at just the right time. And think about it, the broccoli crowns in their size, they will vary between varieties, but they'll also vary between gardens, between seasons. So even if the seed package or the plant tag tells you that the broccoli crown gets 6 to 8 inches, it might not. You need to look at the texture and the composition of that broccoli crown in order to know when you should pull the trigger and harvest. And I also want to offer you this one little tidbit, because as those broccoli crowns begin to form, if you get some rain or you're doing some overhead watering, which I always encourage drip irrigation, watering slowly on the soil directly. If that water accumulates on that crown of broccoli, you get some pooling there, it can be really beautiful. But if it sits there for an extended period of time, it can cause some rot or some decay to start to form on your broccoli crown. So after a good rain, I'll come out in my garden and I'll give my broccoli crown a little bit of a shake, maybe a little bit of a few bumps on the side, knock off that water, and then we're all good. And when you're ready to harvest, I recommend using a sharp knife, something like a serrated kitchen knife. I've got a really old one that I don't use inside anymore, but it's great for cutting broccoli crowns because that's a pretty big stem. Usually my bypass pruners or my garden shears aren't enough to do the job. They just don't really get in there, and you might have to take several angles to get that to cut off, which you can do. But a serrated knife works like a charm. And along with that, make sure you do it at an angle, right? You don't want to do it flat across, because just like I talked about water pooling on the top of the broccoli crown itself, water can pool on the stem. And we don't want that to happen, because that can cause some rot or some disease or some mold or something of that nature. And you might think, oh, well, I'm done, right? I grew my broccoli crown. Well, no, you can get broccoli side shoots, vegan drumsticks. This is really the best thing. I love the trophy of the broccoli crown, but those side shoots, you can get 3 or 4 rounds sometimes, and they're really tender and delicious. And why not make the most of this crop that you've been growing, caring for over several months, potentially navigating, late summer heat, midwinter freezing temperatures. Get out there, get to the finish line, and then keep on going as long as you can. Also, that crown, the stem there, a lot of food in that. So don't neglect that. Don't skip that part, because that's really good for you. So we've covered a lot of details in this video about how to grow your broccoli successfully in Central Texas and similar growing zones here in the South. But I want to tell you, there are some specific techniques that I've employed over the years to protect my broccoli through freezing temperatures. Now, this broccoli here is a cold tolerant variety. Many times the upper 20s, it's going to survive just fine, but it really depends on the depth and duration of those temperatures, as well as the wind chill. So with all those variables, I think it's advisable to protect your broccoli plants if you're expecting some freezing weather, some winter precipitation. This is going to provide some continuity of their growth and development, because what I observe after I take off my frost cloth, my row cover, is that my broccoli plants have grown. All right, now some details here to pass along to you. I like to employ low tunnel hoop structures. These are specifically designed to work with my raised beds. So take into consideration your garden design, your layout. I like to create uniform applications that are just easier to replicate from one season to the other. That's why my beds are uniform in nature, and I use the same system with these low tunnels, whether it's shade cloth, frost cloth, and for a variety of crops. Broccoli, in these raised beds is going to get, easily, maybe 30 inches tall, 24 inches wide. I talked about the spacing. Under these low tunnel structures, I have enough space to encompass the broccoli plants without having the row cover sitting directly on top of the broccoli. That's important. You can get some contact burn if you get some winter precipitation or some ice crystals forming on your row cover. So you want to make sure you've got something in there as a barrier between the frost cloth and your broccoli plants. Now, after an initial freeze and I've protected these broccoli plants, if I get a light frost, I might let it go. It really depends on the factors. If I feel confident it's just going to touch 32 and they've had a taste of it, protected, I think you're going to be okay. But what often happens in my Austin garden is about the time that beautiful crown is starting to form, we're getting some Arctic cold fronts. And I'm talking about going from 70, 80 degrees during the day to 20 degrees during the day, or maybe even to the teens for extended periods, hard freezes. This is not good at all. If you've got a beautiful broccoli crown forming, it is going to be more vulnerable than the plant overall in and of itself. So you need to take some more measures beyond that frost cover that I just mentioned to you. And one of the techniques that I've employed, which is very low tech, is simply taking some garden twine or something of that nature and taking the closest leaves to the crown and kind of folding it over, almost like you would do if you were blanching cauliflower, to add an extra layer of protection around that crown. This is perfect for getting through some of these instances here. I've done this before, and along with that, I have mounded up some mulch or some pine straw specifically in between my rows of broccoli, a little bit higher, just again creating more layers of insulation. One way or another, multiple layers may be required during these events, and that's what I'm getting to. Here recently, I employed some different techniques. I had some extra frost cloth, and I simply put it directly on top of the broccoli plants. Now, I know this is counter to what I told you earlier about, you know, avoiding contact, but it goes further than that, right? So I put that cloth directly on top of the plants, just kind of floated it there. It wasn't enough to weigh them down. It was all good. I put some stones on the end. It gave them a nice encapsulated layer of protection. And always remember, with this frost cloth, we are trapping ground heat that accumulates in the soil moisture, and that will keep your plants warm overnight during the coldest periods. Yeah, so along with that, I put a nice layer of frost cloth on top of my hoops. So I had 2 layers of protection for my broccoli. This would mimic the bundling of the leaves around the crowns of the broccoli, which may be really convenient if you've only got 1 or 2 broccoli plants, or a few, say. You could easily do that and cover them, in that system that I described to you. But if you've got a lot growing together, it could be a shortcut just to take an extra piece of the frost cloth, drape it on top, and then put another layer on top of those hoops. So this has proven to be really effective. Ahead of this most recent freezing weather outbreak, I just didn't feel like my broccoli crowns were sized up to their potential, and they weren't, because when I took all this frost cloth off, they had grown pretty good, and even since then, even bigger. If you're not willing to do those measures, which is fine, you decide what to do in your garden, then you might be advised to go ahead and harvest your broccoli crown ahead of some of these polar outbreaks. It might not be the size that you want, but if you don't want to put in all that work, go ahead and get some in the kitchen, and you did it. You grew some broccoli. It's really kind of misting. I see the fox. Now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel. Like this video and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own food. Keep it organic.